Chapter 8. The new volunteer teacher woke up late just as he had announced. It was already 9:30 a.m. when he came to because of the heat from the sun that was burning through the roof. Tien got up and lazily stretched his limbs. The man that had been lying next to him that the night before had already been gone, perhaps going back to his camp. It didn't matter. He didn't care that much anyway. As he picked up his towel and toothbrush, his eyes caught the sporty traveling bag that the captain had brought with him. The young man cocked his eyebrow, puzzled, and rushed down the stairs to look at the space under the hut. He saw dishes of salted egg, canned fermented Chinese cabbage, and the cold boiled rice, all of the familiar simple food, being laid out on the litter. But there was no sight of the man he was looking for. Where the hell did he go? Ken headed towards the earthen jar at the back of his house. He was still thankful that someone had filled the water for him every morning. He undressed, leaving only a boxer on, and placed his clothes on the toilet's door frame nearby and brushed his teeth. It was late morning and the temperature was warm enough for him to take a cold bath. He picked up a plastic bowl, scooped up the cold water, and splashed it all over his body. He did it with ease comparing to the first day, and thought that he could get used to it in no time. The black charcoal soap made bubbles and gave off a sweet jasmine fragrance that freshened him up every time. He pushed the bar under his boxer and poured the water down himself until he was thoroughly cleaned. Even if there was no one around, he still had enough decency to keep one remaining piece on instead of being butt naked and getting the mountain and forest spirits to curse at him. Tian lifted the towel from the door to dry himself before wrapping it around his waist. He pulled the wet boxer down and put on the t-shirt. His bath was done. The young man whistled as he went back into the hut to rummage through his backpack. Then he let out a loud curse. Fuck! I've run out of clothes! The wealthy young man pulled at his hair. He finally wore all of the clothes he'd brought on the journey for after 1 week. But now, he didn't know how to wash the clothes by hands, and there was no detergent around. What's wrong with you? You're constipated, or is the toilet clogged? The officer who had just returned asked, seeing how the younger man hunched with his hands over his head as if someone had just died. Worse! The fop, who was on the brink of breaking down and crying, said in a broken voice, I have no clean clothes left to wear. Once he finished the sentence, the captain almost flipped over. So, you wash the clothes. It's simple. That's not simple. I don't know how to wash the clothes. Kufa slapped his forehead not too gently. How could he forget that this city boy was incapable of taking care of himself? All he could do was play with an expensive mobile phone. The captain shook his head in exasperation and walked to pull out some spare clothes from his sporty traveling bag. You can wear mine. I'll take you to the waterfall. Tian looked at the crumpled, faded green khaki t-shirt with Trapiro, the god of rain, holding an embroiled discus, the namesake of the operating base, and football sweatpants with a loose elastic waist, and freaked out. "Y- You want me to wear these?" Back at his family house, they would have to think twice to turn these clothes into rags. If you want to go bare ass, be my guest. The captain was going to put the clothes into his backpack, but Tian grabbed it to take a closer look. This is a military tee. I'm not a soldier. Will I be in trouble for wearing them? No, you won't. Soldiers' wives wear them all the time. The words were unnervingly straightforward. Red hues crept up the smooth cheeks. I'm not your wife! Tian shouted, wanting to neck kick the massive monster, but his legs were too short. Ufa shrugged and turned towards the door. Get dressed already. I'll be under the hut so we can have the breakfast. The deep, deadpan voice was getting on Ken's nerves. If he was just a small kid, he would be stomping his feet right now, that someone hadn't bent over his will. He took off his t-shirt and reluctantly put the one the captain had given him on. The tea was old and faded, yet it smelled sweet and clean from the detergent and sunlight that was refreshing and warm. He shook his head, pushing away the silly thoughts, and ran down the hut to meet the other man who was waiting for him on the litter. The cold rice was once again warm, after the captain had reheated it on the brazier, and the white smokes rose from the fluffy rice with a jasmine fragrance. The city boy jumped in and scooped up the rice with a spoon and ravenously munched it with a salted egg. Pupa watched the starving boy and smiled to himself, amused. Ken was sitting cross-legged, wearing a faded tee and wrinkled pants and tousled hair. If the younger man saw himself in the mirror now, he would have started kicking and screaming. Once they finished having breakfast, the captain took the volunteer teacher to Kama Bingma's house to borrow a plastic basin for the boys wearing clothes. They then walked the distance to the waterfall and heard the thunderous sound from the cliff as the water hit the basin below. Ken wanted to have another bath right here. Not far away, a group of young Akha girls from the village were washing their clothes by putting them on a boulder on the river bank and step on them with their feet. They were giggling as they saw the two men approaching and gave them coy smiles. Pupa greeted back by a slight nod and took the troublesome Brad to a spot further down the stream. Ken dropped the heavy basin with his clothes on the large slab of rock, grimacing at the massive officer. Captain, I don't think these clothes can take the weight of my feet. If the villagers' cheap, hand-woven clothes can, then yours can. Why would you spend thousands of baht on them if they can't? Pupa crouched down and started putting the colorful clothes on the rock. Different fabrics for different usage. The city boy put his hands on his hips, ready to fight back. I'm serious, Cap. I don't have time for your sarcasm. Use your hands then. The captain pulled down the boy's hand to sit down next to him. Slowly wet the clothes in the water. Ian grudgingly did what he was told. As he soaked the clothes in the river, he couldn't help asking, why do we only have a bar of soap? Why not use a detergent? Our ancestors used vinegar to wash the clothes. This soap was made with natural ingredients and is eco-friendly. If it cleans your body, why can't it clean your clothes? The city boy hummed as a response. He rubbed the soap on the clothes until bubbles were foaming up and clumsily scrubbed the fabric by hands. It looked so awkward that the captain of the company had to issue another order. Hold the fabric tight between your two hands and scrub them against each other. Rub the soap on the stains. Ken forcefully scrubbed the wet clothes, frustrated, until he heard the stitches break. Everything became silent. The almond eyes widened as if the man fell into an utter shock, and he let out a loud whine as if he was being traumatized. Look! My Topman shirt! It's your fault! He jumped up on his feet, flinging the pricey, colorful shirt towards the massive officer who was sitting, and sending white bubbles with the refreshing jasmine scent into the other man's tanned, handsome face. Captain Pupa slowly rose to his full height. The dark shadow that rose along with him made Tien involuntarily take a step back. Rough, thick hand wiped away the bamboo charcoal suds from his cheekbone, and the intense, dark eyes fixed on the younger man who became paralyzed. Tien swallowed thickly. It, it was your fault. You can't put the blame on me. Tian made a lame excuse, but it sounded futile. I'm not blaming you. Pupa growled darkly and shouted thunderously. But I'm going to punish you. Tian startled and threw the wet shirt into the captain's face as the older man was lunging at him. It made things even worse. Pupa yanked the expensive shirt and threw it on the ground, uncaring if he damaged it. He grabbed the brat's wrist, wanting to spank him until Tian asked for forgiveness. But the boy was as nimble as a monkey, jumping into the river and trotting further into the deeper water, breaking it into waves, until the level reached his knees. Pupa caught up with him with his long legs and strides. The younger man had to employ a new tactic by spinning around to face his opponent and splashing the water at the officer at close range. Pupa instinctively held up his hands to protect his face, but he still got the water in his face. This is how you're going to play? You've asked for it. Pupa stripped off his t-shirt and used it as a shield, lunging and locking him around the torso. Ouch! I can't breathe! Let me go, you monster! Ian wriggled, trying to pry the strong, muscular arms that gripped around his waist away. His struggle was futile, and the captain started his punishment. He started tickling him at the waist. The boy, who was sensitive to the touch, screamed out loud, bending over as all his strength left his body. Ken was enraged that the officer had discovered more of his weaknesses. He decided to resort to a more feminine strategy by digging his nails in the hard arms, and it worked. Pupa yanked his arms away as pain shot through his two limbs, and yet he followed the rascal relentlessly. The battle went on as the two grown men threw water at each other as if they were two little kids until they both got soaking wet. Tian took his turn to use his close quarter combat skill. He threw himself at the thick waist from behind and tickled the man's six packs. Then he found out it worked as well as using a lath to lift up a boulder because the captain remained unresponsive to the attack. The monster slowly turned around and growled at him, baring his fangs. Too bad, I'm not that ticklish. You're saying you're impenetrable? Are you having enough fun? Uba charged at the smart ass like a rugby player. The slighter man was lifted up in the air, and Tien shrieked, twisting his legs around the captain's torso like a python. They both fell back into the river. The clear water splashed and fell on both young men, soaking them. Pupa let out a soft sigh. He had a quick reflex and spun around to go under the younger man before the fall. Otherwise, Tien would have had a broken bone. The man who was straddling on him pushed up, feeling out of breath as if being punched in the guts as he crashed into the man under him. When he realized what his cushion was, he blurted out panic. Did you crack your skull? It wasn't him caring that much about the other man's well-being, but the basin was full of rocks. He didn't want to become a murderer at his young age. My skull is intact, but my body isn't. Get off of me, you heavy butt. Instead of following the order, the troublemaker burst out laughing. What are you laughing at? Seeing the captain's scowl, Ken gave him an even wider grin. You look like a wet dog. The naked tanned skin, the wet hair that was plastered against that shapely head, and the man who laid on his back in the water. The captain looked just like a sea lion. He even liked to bare his white fangs just like the big animal. The way Tien's glistening almond eyes narrowed as the boy was looking at him gave Pupa inexplicable goosebumps. What was going on inside that head couldn't be good. He snorted, frustrated, and lifted the slender form off of him. Stop fooling around. Go wash your clothes and finish it. Now! Yes, sir, Captain! What a fuss. Tian gave him a mocking salute, lingering around for a brief moment to get on the older man's nerves before reluctantly returning to the piles of wet clothes. The sun was high above their heads when the two men left the waterfall. The noontime's glaring sun made the cool breeze that touched their wet skin become gentler. They were using the route that cut through the center of the village, and the elderly folks who spotted the two dripping young men started to snicker. Why is it so crowded today? Are they taking a weekend break from farming like a 9 to 5 job? The city boy asked out of curiosity. The villagers started their day at dawn break and only returned home at sunset, but now they were all over the place. They're preparing for a wedding. The captain answered plainly, but his answer made Tien's eyes widen. You went to Uncle Bingley yesterday to ask for his daughter's hand? The intense eyes glanced at the troublemaker who was pretending to be in shock, wanting to kick him in the rear. He let out an exasperated sigh. Kama Bingley's children are all male. Yen snorted, muttering not too quietly. Isn't that exactly how you like it? What are you grumbling? Hurry up! Pupa pulled the lean arm that was carrying the plastic basin towards Kama's house. They would ask for dry clothes and change before they could catch a fever. The villagers flocked to Kama Bingley's house to ask counsel about the wedding. The soon-to-be a groom would travel to the next village to ask for permission to marry a girl. They sat on a mattress in the living room or open space on the second floor, and merrily chatted among themselves until the newcomers walked up the stairs. Two sodden young men called the elder, stopping at the steps, not wanting to wet the floor. As soon as Kama Bingley saw who the visitors were, he hurriedly fetched a towel and put it down on the floor for them to clean their feet. Did you go for a swim? Both arch-enemies glared at each other, once again falling into another optical warfare. The elder had to suppress his laugh, seeing the stern officer and the new teacher bickering like two little kids. The captain thought the weather was too hot, Tian said sarcastically, but the captain's response was neutral and humorless. I'm cold. Silence fell over the room. Bing Le cleared his throat before another cold war broke out. So you need new clothes? Is that it? He knew because when they had come to ask for a plastic basin, the teacher was already wearing a soldier's green t-shirt. Now, as the two were soaking wet, it was clear they didn't have any dry clothes to change. Let me fetch my son's clothes for you. Sorry for the trouble, Kama, Pupa said, being considerate of Kama's feelings, and dragged the rascal who became the target of the villagers' scrutiny in a wet t-shirt that was plastered on his skin. Ken was hugging his knees on the litter, shuddering every time the cold breeze touched his skin, while the other man appeared intact. His lips that had turned purple sneered, annoyed by the captain's indifference. You said you were cold. You're just unresponsive like a rock. The captain's sharp eyes glanced at the younger man who was jabbing at him and let out a mocking smile. My body's fine. It's my heart that's cold. Tian was taken aback. Once his brain stopped processing the words, he craned his neck as if he was about to throw up. That's disgusting! The captain shrugged, indifferent to the mockery. As Kama Bingley showed up with the clothes, Pupa walked up to him and thanked the elder, taking the clothes and telling him they were leaving now. As they returned, Ken, with thinner skin, took up the only room to change, while the officer was flicking the wet clothes and drying them under the hut. After Ken had dried off his hair and body, he turned to pick the clothes Kama had given him to wear, but he came to a sudden halt as he saw a hand-woven cotton indigo shirt with colorful embroideries at the hem and cropped pants with drawstrings. The young man grimaced. He didn't take a good look when he was given the clothes. What to do with them? The cold air that blew into the hut helped him make up his mind. Ken pushed down his nervousness and put on the Akha clothes as quickly as he could before being frozen. He lifted the basin with the washed garment and laid them out on the window frame. He hung the rest to dry in the wind on the tiny balcony. Pupa, who had just finished getting dressed, looked up and froze. He held back his laugh until his jaws hurt, and got a glare from the man who was shaking the clothes to dry. On what hill are you plucking your carrots, bro? The lean, tall form with a smooth, fair complexion and an effeminate face framed by a modern haircut didn't fit with the ethnic costumes at all. Yet the gap between a city boy and the hill tribe had already been shortened. The same hill you are on! Tian wanted to throw the basin at the captain. Even if Fupa was wearing similar hand-woven clothes, the officer's shirt was a boat neck that fitted him just right. Taking a better look, Tian wanted to bite his lips from jealousy. The tall, muscular form made the captain look like a warrior, not the carrot picker that he was. Life isn't fair. Are you done hanging the clothes? Do you want to help them out or lunging around here? The captain asked. Tian's bright eyes were shone with hesitation. You meant the wedding? What about you? I've told Kama since the morning that I'd help. Tian went quiet, taking a good look around the empty room in his small hut. He decided that life would be too boring if he lingered here the whole day. There was no internet after all. I'll go with you. Wait a sec. He turned around and took his after meal medicine before he'd have forgotten. On the wide open yard next to the edge of the woods, the men were carrying bamboo stalks and laid them down on the ground. Some cut the woods with a big knife into strips to make a raft. Tama Bingle beckoned the two men who had just arrived to join in. He smiled widely, seeing how well their native tribal clothes looked on the two. Are the clothes comfortable? My wife made them for our son when he turned 15. Sorry that they were quite old and musty. Tian smiled at Kama as he saw how proud the older man was. He hoped the village chief wasn't implying he was barely taller than a junior high school boy. He must have turned into a very tall man then. Nearly as tall as the captain. Bing Le laughed happily, talking about his beloved son who had just enrolled in a university in downtown Chiang Rai. The boy only came home during the school vacations. He must have fed a buffalo when he was a kid. Tian grumbled, looking at the broad, strong shoulders like a solid cliff, befitting the name of the towering officer. The said commander of the company was chatting with other villagers who knew the Thai language on the other side of the yard. We're making a palanquin to carry the bride from a village in the mountains next to us. A palanquin? Tian was looking up the word in his mental dictionary. Oh, you meant the elevated seat carried by men? Yes. The seat must be able to hold the weight of both the grooms and the brides. You need a lot of men to do the job, don't you? Quite. We need 4 men in the front, 4 in the back. If they don't walk in unison, the palanquin would topple down. The village chief said jokingly, yet the incident wouldn't be funny to the lovebirds. The route through the forest and the dirt road was rough and winding, and the haulers must be able to carry the litter, the bride and the groom at the same time, to the destination. It was a staggering task. Ken nodded half-heartedly. Kama Bing Le instructed him to scrape off splinters with a knife while the captain built the raft with the villagers. 3 hours later, the wooden palanquin started to look like one. The men were connecting the carrying beams by inserting fat stalks of bamboo underneath the litter and tied them tightly with the hemp ropes. 8 strong men, who would be the haulers, took their spots to test the palanquin. The voices as they raced the vehicle in unison rang out across the woods. Many times one of them lost the balance and the litter nearly toppled. Seeing their reddened faces from the weight of the wood, Ken couldn't help but wanted them to succeed. Is it necessary to carry the palanquin on the shoulder? He murmured to himself, but Kama Bingle, the operations chief, who stood nearby, heard it. Not necessary. Our purpose is to honor the bride by going and welcoming her to the groom's village. If she doesn't have to come on foot, that would be good enough. The Akha from a village near the city with asphalt roads even drives the trucks to do so. So it'd be good enough if the palanquin is at the arm level. Papanda's village chief turned towards the city boy and his eyes widened with a sudden realization. That's correct. How could he have forgotten what faculty the volunteer teacher was in? What's on your mind? You can tell me. What? Ken blurted out, surprised that the older man was asking for his opinion. He rubbed his neck nervous. No, I'd rather not. I don't think it's going to work. It's better than not having an opinion at all. A deep voice came up as Captain Pupa walked closer, his body soaked in sweat, and the intense, sharp eyes looked at the younger man as if to mentally pull out something from that brain. Don't push me like this, the engineering student from a famous university said, feeling uneasy. Have you ever seen a Chinese palanquin? Like in a Chinese movie? It's got a roof and the person inside, but it takes only 2 carriers. I know what it is, but I doubt they do. Pupa smiled lightly, turning towards the young Akhamen who gathered around the new volunteer teacher, curious of what he was saying even if they didn't understand every word he said. Tian looked around, taking in the expectant look from everyone, and let out a heavy sigh. He bent down to pick up a stick and started drawing on the sandy ground. It was a picture of a boxy palanquin with long wood sticking out from the middle, the one used in ancient China. It's cold in China, so they closed it with 4 walls just like this. The more he drew, the better idea he was coming up with. Our version doesn't have to be fanciful. Just make a boxy structure on top of the seat, then roof it with tack. No walls needed. This one will be much lighter. How do you carry this Chinese palanquin? Kama Bingle asked, having never seen one that sounded and looked so peculiar like the one in the drawing. He was trying his best to learn and understand so he could explain it to his people. First of all, you stand in between the beams and put your hands on both sides. Then, you lift it vertically. You think the guy's wrists will be able to take the weight? From what you just said, it takes only 2 people to carry it. The cogs were working in his mind, and Ken's eyes rolled back and forth. His brain, that had been in inertia for a while, started to fire up. I think it's okay to put the beams on the shoulders, the bigger part of the body that can lessen the weight. But when you're lifting something heavy, you won't be able to elevate it much. He tapped his chin a few times and used the stick to draw something on the ground. If we add a beam on the top of the roof at the same height as the shoulders, then loop a rope around the upper and the lower beams to strengthen them, it's possible to use just 4 carriers. When you lift it, the hands and the shoulders will hold the weight, making it easier to carry. If this method works, you'll only need 4 men. When you walk, You'll also be able to keep the balance on both sides. The quick solution that flew out of the new teacher's mouth made everyone amazed. However, the man who came up with the idea looked up as no one was speaking. It was a bad idea, isn't it? So you'd better use the old version. Who said it was a bad idea? It's brilliant. Bingle shot forward and patted heartily on Tian's thin shoulder with excitement. He turned towards the men that stood around them, waiting for the next command, and clapped to signal, shouting long sentences in his native language. The villagers answered enthusiastically, thrilled like never before. They proceeded to work and used new beams to make a new palanquin instead of taking the old one apart for the woods. You like inventing? Captain Pupa asked with his arms across his chest as he listened quietly. Tian, who stood confounded at the sight of the sudden change around him, turned towards the officer, his eyes wavering. I did. Once. Why the past tense? The past tense? Because I don't like it anymore. He raised his eyebrows, wanting to get on the captain's nerves and hiding his true feelings. Before the other man could ask another question, the younger man started walking towards the village chief who was calling for him. Yes, he loved taking apart his toys when he was a little boy, especially the ones that moved, like cars or robots that used batteries. When they had been broken, he'd take the components and put them back together again, one by one, to create a new invention. Every time he wanted to show off his creation to his parents, who never had time for him, they were never there to listen. When he showed his works to his friends from wealthy families, they laughed at him and called his brainchild trashes. From that day on, little Tienza Fadesecol had learned an important lesson that if he wanted to be accepted in the social circle he was born into, to be praised and applauded, he had to act above everyone else. He had to be the wealthiest, living the most flamboyant life, driving the fastest imported cars, carrying the latest model of mobile phones, and dressing himself up in most luxurious clothes from head to toes. The materialistic world drowned people in worldly pleasure and made them forget their true selves. Teacher, how wide should the seat be? Kama Bingle's question pulled the new teacher from his reverie. Just wide enough for two people. 2 meters should be fine. The villager's chief face split into a wide smile. We don't have a measuring tape, and the folks here never learned about measuring units either. Oh, Jan exclaimed as the realization hit him. He scratched his head and walked towards the pile of cut bamboos on the ground. He picked the smallest one up and estimated a 1 meter length on it. When he got the measurement he needed, he signaled the villager who was holding an axe to cut the bamboo. Can you tell them to use this stalk as a measurement tape? From my estimation, it wouldn't miss the exact length by 10 centimeters. He instructed the elderly man how to use the tool and went on. You know everything. You're even fluent in Central dialect. I've got a scholarship for underprivileged kids from His Majesty the King. His Majesty King Bumibol, King Rama the Ninth. Back in those days, there were special education programs for hill tribe children living along the borders. One child per one village would be sent to school in the city until they completed Morsor 5, or More 6 nowadays. Morsor 5 is the equivalent of grade 12 or More 6 in the present-day high school system. Then, I worked as a temp employee at a governmental organization in downtown Chiang Rai until I returned home to settle down, as you see. Uncle Bingle told his life story with pride. His Majesty King Bumibal's generosity had enabled him to return to his homeland and developed the village where his parents, his grandparents, and the ancestors before him had lived. I had no idea. He never realized that the many royal duties aired on TV in the evening news actually helped change the lives of many destitute people. It was peculiar when he thought about it. City people like him had more advantages and opportunities, and yet they only saw the king on TV. But the villagers in rural areas whose voices weren't heard were actually the ones the king had visited despite the difficult, impossible terrains. When you have free time, go and stand on the highest spot of Papandao and look downhill. Look around. You'll see the verdant forests and grown farms. All of those were born from His Majesty the King's initiations. That's awesome! Let's call it a fortune. We are fortunate to be born on this land. Tian smiled, feeling the sense of pride that Kama Bingley had experienced. But perhaps he was smiling too wide because a pang shot through him from the bruises on his cheek. The village chief's expression darkened as he saw the teacher grimaced. I've wanted to talk to you about this. The middlemen who took advantage of our people weren't just Master Sakta and his men. But if you ever see something like that again, you have to tell me or the captain. Do not take the matter in your own hands. If I do that, the villagers would have been duped already. He frowned, unable to comprehend the older man's words. Let me ask you something. If I tell you what happened, what would you or the captain do? The question was harder to answer than what comes first between a hen or an egg. Tama Bing Lip pondered quietly for a moment before letting out a long sigh. Rutian, I can't tell you everything about the mafia around here, but trust me, you weren't the first volunteer teacher who tried to help the villagers and are still intact. The older man patted Tian's shoulder to emphasize his words. This is all I can say for now. You're a smart guy. I hope you know what I meant. Ken clicked his tongue, annoyed that he got another reprimand about the incident. They kept calling him a smart guy. What if he wanted to be dumb sometimes? He shook his head and went to help the villagers put the palanquin together. Que sera sera, the young man thought. The Chinese palanquin was modified into a simpler version from the chief engineer who supervised every step, down to the last procedure when the rope was tied to the bamboo strips. Once the palanquin was completed, Ken signaled the four men who stood at the same height to hoist the seat from the ground. A single bamboo stalk stuck out from the roof structure was placed on two men's shoulders as they carried the two lower beams. Even if the vehicle looked odd, it was easy to maneuver, and the new design distributed the weight better than the previous version. The engineering student caressed his chin, pondering before signaling the men to put the palanquin down. He measured the length with his eyes and told the men who understood the Thai language to saw off some excessive centimeters. Even if the longer beams made the palanquin lighter, it was too difficult to carry. When it was finally perfected, Ken gave the seat the final check. He walked around the palanquin, touching it here and there, before giving a thumbs up to the villagers who were waiting for his approval. The work was done. The men who put their hearts and labor in building the palanquin shouted in a loud cheer, clapping their hands and encircling the volunteer teacher to thank him in the heavily accented Thai language. The young man, who was the epicenter of the attention, shook their hands, accepting their genuine smiles, overwhelmed. Captain Pupa, who has observed the whole scene, approached the chief engineer, who was smiling sheepishly, not knowing how to react, and placed his hands on the back of his round skull. Good job. When he saw no reaction from the younger man, Pupa looked down and saw tears in the boy's eyes. He gently smiled. What you do is worth something. Even if you cannot see it, you do. So you don't have to be just like someone else. Don't fight to be someone you are not just to please others. It was something he wished someone had told him 1,000 years ago. He didn't need an expensive reward nor praise. All he needed is just someone who accepted him for who he was. Tian sniffed the clear liquid leaking out of his nose and half-heartedly brushed off the hand on the back of his head, giving a mock frown. I'm not a little kid anymore. Pupa held back his laughs and handed the younger man a plastic cup filled with cold, refreshing rainwater. You want some water, Mr. Grown Man? The teacher scowled at the captain's teasing. He grabbed the cup and gulped down the water. Are you hungry? Ken shouted. I can eat a horse! The soft-boiled vegetables and chili paste he had during lunchtime were already gone from his system. Hold on. The doc was running some errands downtown. He said he'd bring back a steamed duck in a sweet brown sauce from a famous shop. Once he heard the doc's name from the captain's lips, Ken wore his pants. I thought you two were going to eat each other out. The captain ignored the sexual innuendo. I said, we'll eat a duck, not one another. I heard you. I'm not deaf. Pupa frowned deeply, unable to catch up with the boy's mood swing. Why are you upset? I said I'm hungry. Tien slammed his words and brushed past the captain, heading towards Kama Bingle, who had been watching the verbal duel from afar. The captain watched the younger man walk away and shook his head in exasperation. It was close to 6 p.m. The sun was setting, the sky dimmed. Doctor Wasan parked his car at the village's back way and walked up the slope with a handful of food bags. Once he reached the hut, he called for his tall, massive friend who had been sitting on the litter under the house to take the food. What did you buy? It's a lot. Pupa looked into the bags as he opened them and put the food on the plates. I bought all that's left in the shop to make Nong Tian feel better. I heard he's put up quite a fight. The young captain's lips tugged into a smile. I guess he thought himself a Bruce Lee. Luckily, they didn't pull a gun. Hosan put the plate down and poured the jasmine rice with a long, heavy sigh. Not a good start, wasn't it? I'm afraid it wouldn't last long. Even if the area was protected by the military, some dark influences still loomed above. It was a remote area where development was minimal and the villagers were barely educated, so it gave an opening for people to take advantage of them. The forest was still abundant and the rangers worked hard by patrolling tens of kilometers each day to look out for looters. When Pupa and he had transferred to the base, they were faced with incidents almost every day, fighting with the looters and drug smugglers until it became less and less as the years went by. They must have seen how unyielding this captain was, so they decided to move on to the next targeted area. But not all of them had left though. It's better that way. The simple but firm words drew the doctor's eyes towards the captain. The corner of the thin lips lifted up in a knowing smile. Are you being serious? I am. The man answered, but he was looking at the other day, unable to meet his friend's eyes. The doctor straightened up and crossed his arms, like he had an upper hand. Don't think I don't know what's on your mind, you bastard. You were after him since day one. When he first arrived, you never left his side. Even last night, you're so shameless that you pushed yourself into the hut and spent the night there. You want to give me all the bullshit? Fine, go ahead. I'm not buying it. This was the first time ever that he regretted having this goddamn son of a gun as his best friend. They'd spent years at the first camp together. Once he got transferred, he even asked to follow him here. He couldn't deny the doctor knew him in and out. Can you keep your fucking nose out of my business just this once? Pupa slammed the plate of a steamed duck that he had just poured from the bag on the litter, frustrated. Well, there's one thing I don't know. The reason you're watching over him like a mother hen, was it because it was first love? Like first love at first sight? Or it was an order from you know who? The captain went quiet as he averted his glance towards the plates, feeling uneasy. This is the first thing you should really keep your nose out of. You fucking prick! Are you keeping something from me? Wasant cussed loudly before adding another threat. Fine, I'm going to tell the boy to watch his back and never trust you. An empty threat, Pupa said nonchalantly, and the doctor clicked his tongue, annoyed. Don't be so cocky. You don't even know how he feels about you. The captain didn't have any comeback for that. He said nothing and turned to lift a bottle of water and put it on the litter to say that this conversation was over. Seeing how unresponsive his bestie was, the young doctor volunteered to fetch the teacher who had taken a nap before taking the meal. Once his friend left, Pupa slumped down on the litter, feeling depleted. If he didn't have any misplaced hope in the first place, why would he care what the younger man thought of him then? Ken rushed down the stairs because his stomach and its parasitic residents were growling in protest. The almond eyes widened with excitement seeing the food that he knew well. From a steamed duck in brown sauce, crispy pork and roasted pork, and deep fried crispy shrimp dumplings. He turned towards his benefactor with a wide, grateful grin. Thank you so much, Big Dog. These are all my favorites. I'm glad you like them. You can eat as much as you want. I don't want people to say that we're not taking good care of you up here. Wasant wanted to pet the boy's head, but there were two pairs of malicious eyes staring at him. You don't have to worry. I'm going to gulp down everything. Yan patted his flat stomach in reassurance. Too bad. The rice isn't warm anymore. I bought it in the afternoon. It was well into the evening when I got back here. The military physician handed the plate full of rice towards the teacher, who had already sat down on the litter. I'm used to the cold rice by now. I think it's an acquired taste, and it's better than not having anything to eat at all. Yan babbled as he put a big, plump piece of duck in his mouth. The two men who were holding their spoons mid-air turned to look at each other as if they were sharing the same thoughts. Something in this boy was changing. The younger man looked up, sensing the silence. What are you guys waiting for? You're not gonna eat. I'm going to finish the plate. He swept the crispy pork with sauce into his own plate and munched on it. Hey, Doc, you have any pills for the gastric problem with you? Pupa asked. Nope. Is someone sick? Not now, but soon. I'm afraid someone's insatiable stomach is going to burst. Yan whipped his eyes towards the tall captain and retorted by taking the food from every plate and putting it on Puva's plate until it was full. Eat up and keep your mouth busy, Cap. Well, seeing how you were well taken care of, you'd better ask your mama to talk to his mama for a marriage arrangement. Dr. Wasant said with a smirk to his friend. My mom passed away since I was 10. And if you're going to keep talking about my dad, tonight I'm going to light the incense and ask for his spirit to break your neck. Pupa finished the sentence with a finger slashing across his neck. All right, I yield. The doctor raised the white flag and turned towards the teacher. I think the man would have a great time tonight. Why so? Isn't the wedding tomorrow? Wasan chuckled slowly, as if he knew something. According to ancient Aka tradition, When a man is getting married, he must release all impurity from his body by sleeping with Sakor, or a widow who was appointed to pop the groom's cherry and teaches him a love lesson. What? The younger man's mouth fell open, hearing the peculiar ritual. Can this be the origin of a bachelor's party? He'd witnessed it as a norm from his circles. I don't know about that. Perhaps it was just men's egocentricity that became the norm. Wasan shrugged and put the rice into his mouth. Then, why did you say that all the men will be having a good time? Isn't this the ritual for the groom alone? The older man smiled knowingly. His eyes narrowed like a fox, and he leaned in to whisper against the white tip of the ear. Tonight, you can take a walk in the village. If you see a group of men with a torch or a lamp, follow them. Are you going to finish your goddamn meal so we can return to the base? Cuba cut in loudly before his friend would put more wrong ideas into the troublemaker's head. Still, Ken didn't get it. He let it go and went back to eat the delicacy before him until his stomach was hurt. When they were done cleaning the plates, the younger man walked the guests off like he normally did. The captain didn't get into the car with his friend since he had his own motorbike. Before leaving, he didn't forget to remind Tian that he shouldn't wander out at night because it wasn't safe to do so. The teacher nodded casually, fed up with the warning, and waved his hand to dismiss the captain. He walked back to put the kettle on the brazier to make a hot bath at the back of the hut. He gritted his teeth as he ran naked back into his room after the bath was done in the cold and felt the cramp creeping in. Suddenly, his eyes caught a glimpse of something. It was the plastic basin he'd borrowed from Kama Bingley, which he forgot to return. A man in his favorite jacket and damp pajama pants, were standing in front of the biggest house in Papandao village. He was shuddering and shouting for the house's owner. A wooden door behind the staircase slowly opened, and Kama Bingley pried out with a lamp to look. Crew, what has brought you here in the dark? I forgot to give you back the basin. I'm afraid your wife will need it in the morning. He knew most Akha wives went to wash their clothes at the waterfall at dawn. Oh dear, you didn't have to bother. We've got a lot of basins here. You can keep this one. Ah, all right. Ken rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed that he came for nothing. Before he turned to leave, the village chief called out as if he'd thought of something. It's good that you came. Come on in. We have something for you. Me? Ken frowned, wondering who would that be, but walked up the stairs as asked. He sat down on the mattress on the floor with a basin by his side, looking left and right to take in Akha's household condition. He found that the house did speak about Kama Bingley's education and work experience in the city. The house was full of modern utilities, and he even had a bookshelf. His eyes caught a picture in a gold frame. It was a photo of King Bhumibol as he visited people in remote areas of Thailand. The poster made from the photo was so lifelike that one could clearly see the beads of sweat on His Majesty's face, and how hard he had worked for his people. Tian thought about the hanging calendar with His Majesty's photo on a cupboard at the back of the classroom. The nail had fallen off, so the calendar was placed that way. He was thinking about borrowing a hammer from Kama Bingley to put the calendar up again. Perhaps the children would feel more encouraged to study seeing the picture of the king. Sorry to keep you waiting. Bingley showed up from his bedroom with his wife, who was carrying Akha traditional costumes. My wife just finished fixing up the last shirt. Why so many clothes? The wealthy young man asked, puzzled. The older man gently smiled as he took the clothes from his wife and put them in front of the teacher. This menswear was the finest woven costumes made by our people. Some of them were old from being locked away, but my wife had repaired them for you. Today, the guys were so happy seeing how you were wearing their clothes, and you helped them building the bride's palanquin. So they wanted to repay your kindness. Ken went silent, feeling his eyes full. They like to see me wearing the same clothes they do? A lot of people here like wearing city clothes to look modern, but not many city people like folk costumes like ours. Kama put his hands on the pile of clothes with colorful embroideries. If you don't mind, will you accept these old clothes? I. He swallowed down his sobbing. Despite being here for only a short time, he could tell that his self-esteem that had been wiped out was coming back to life in full force. How can I say no? Ken bent down to embrace the clothes as if they were the most precious gifts and turned towards Kama's wife, who was smiling at him. Kulong mate, auntie, he said very cute in Akha dialect that he had learned from the men in the afternoon. He knew the sentence was broken, but it still drew out a hearty laugh from both elders. Hijay manger ako. Hearing the response from his wife, Bingley translated the sentence. You're welcome, crew. Ken put the clothes in the basin, bowed farewell to the hosts, and went down the stairs. He cast the flashlight along the rough road in the middle of the village. It was a moonless night, and the glistening stars were visible in the dark sky. The temperature had also dropped to a chilling degree, and he saw the stream of white smokes from his breath. The city boy, who had never experienced such coldness in Thailand, wiped the clear liquid that oozed out of his nose. He then caught a glimpse of something unusual, the light coming from a group of men in the dark who tiptoed behind the row of wooden houses. They recognized the other's presence and stopped to look. The shadow stepped out with a kerosene lamp in hand, and he could see the familiar faces in the dark. They were the group of young men who were making the palanquin with him in the moon. What were they doing out here at night? Before he got his answer, they started waving at him. Ken looked left and right and pointed at himself. Were they calling at him? When they nodded yes and quickened their beckon, he paced towards them without a second thought. When they saw how the volunteer teacher was joining them, they slapped on his slim shoulders with a pleased laugh and ushered him to walk with them. Ken went along, puzzled, with a flashlight in one hand and a basin in the other. He remembered Dr. Nam's words in the evening and started to realize why this group of men came out at night with a lamp. Thrill shot through him like a teen sneaking out to do something against the rules. They walked till they reached the foot of the hill quite far away and spotted a sole hut that was built behind a large tree. Why are we here? Ken asked quietly, but it rang loud in the total silence. The men turned towards him in unison and put their index fingers on their lips to tell him to keep quiet. The new volunteer teacher shut his mouth as told and tiptoed behind the men towards the hut. The pioneer straightened up to look for an opening in the woven bamboo wall and found one. He beckoned his friends to come closer. The lamplight from the interior was bright enough to see a faint glimpse of moving shadows inside. The low moans and soft chatters and the leering smiles from the young men let him know what was going on in that hut. The Akka men saw how he was standing back and pulled him closer, hoping that he would have a better view of the sexual activity between the groom and Sa for her through the peeping hole. The widow's two plump breasts were in full view right before his eyes, making him cry out loud. Before he finished the words, a hand slapped over his mouth. Unable to move, Yan had to watch the live porn with an uneasy feeling in his guts. The quick breathing coming from the young men around him as the man in the hut approached his target made him want to look away, but his eyes were transfixed on the sight. The two smooth thighs opened wide, ready to let the man in. The hardness that showed off the fertility of the young groom slowly disappeared into the woman's body. When he started to move, low moans of the love-lesson widow made all the peeping toms started to shudder from the thrill. Did you guys have enough fun? He swore, the low, deep, familiar voice that uttered the sentence in Thai was so quiet and yet powerful. It shot right through their ears and sent the men, who didn't even fully understand the language, into every direction. But alas, the basin was such a hindrance, and Tian was grabbed by a thick hand. Sweats broke out across the smooth forehead, even if the temperature was freezing cold. He cackled a dry laugh before turning towards the imposing officer, who had transformed into an angry monster. Haven't you returned to the base, Cap? I had a hunch that you would do something stupid, so I came back after the shower. I didn't see you at the hut, so I came directly to the ceremonial ground. And I was right. Pupa stressed every word in the last sentence to intimidate the younger man. You don't have to be on my tail, you know. Ken laughed sheepishly as he paled. Why would he be afraid? He wasn't intimidated by this man, just one bit. Go home, now! The captain dragged the troublemaker by the arm, and Tian felt his shoulder almost dislocated. Ouch! Easy, Captain! He yelped a false whine so the officer would go gentler on him, but it was all in vain. The iron grip still held on tightly on his forearm. Pupa was dragging the slender form towards his motorbike that was parked nearby so he could give the ride he could give the boy a ride home. Yet he sensed the awkwardness in the way Tian walked, so he halted and spun around. The sharp eyes raked down the younger man's body and stopped at the bulge. A knowing, cold smile appeared on the dark face. What are you looking at? Tian shouted and pulled the jacket down to conceal his jewel. His face reddened with embarrassment. How much have you seen through that hole? It's none of your business. The younger man pushed the captain, who lowered himself closer as if to tease him. Do you need my help? The tip of the prominent straight nose pressed to the tip of Tian's white ear as the low, raspy voice whispered. We're both men. Don't be embarrassed. He felt goosebumps all over. Tian shut his eyes and shrieked like a buffalo being slaughtered, his voice ringing loud across the mountains. A man who taps other men like you is too dangerous. He bashed the plastic basin into the captain's tight six-pack, and Pupa toppled over. He looked up at the rascal who stomped away towards the motorbike and straddled it. Hurry up! It's freezing out here! Tian shouted. His face tightened into a deep scowl. The young officer let out a long, heavy sigh. The way Tian had said it, did he hear something from the big-mouthed doctor? Once he returned to the base, he was going to kick Wasant's ass. Pupa shook his head in exasperation, because his heart feared that the hope he never had would truly be out of reach. The Akha wedding, according to the long-standing tradition, lasted 3 days. On the first day, they'd take the bride to the groom's house. Then, Yamo, or the village's respected elder, performed a welcoming ritual for the bride by cleansing himself and knock on the room's roof to call the bride's spirit. On the second day, the bride would perform the housewife's duty by cooking for the village's elderly people as a sign of gratitude. On the last day, she had to perform a duty by cutting a red banana, or naning, in the forest and bring the banana stalk to burn and serve it to the guests. The guests would mix vegetable oil with the soup at the bottom of the pot and put it on the others' faces in a chasing game. The groom and the bride would be no exception, as this was a ritual to test their patience if they would be able to spend the rest of their lives together. Tian stood and drank up the whole bowl of water after being invited to join a procession to invite the bride to their village. The winding road throughout the sparse forest as they went uphill and downhill already tired him out, despite not having the weight of the palanquin on him. Yet the other men still talked and laughed, like it was a walk in the park for them. The volunteer teacher was wearing the traditional clothes, with a hat that Kama Bing Le had given to him in the morning. It looked like a headband with a beautiful and colorful knitting wool tassel. He looked like one of them, and no one would have thought he was from the city. Captain Pupa wasn't one of the soldiers who guarded the trip, but it was the rangers who were patrolling the school on shifts. Even if he wondered why the towering officer didn't join in, he held back from asking. Ken stretched lazily to chase away the soreness from the trip and went into the home of the newly wedded couple. The spouses were in the middle of the next ceremony, passing an egg to each other back and forth 3 times. When he frowned with a question in his mind, Kama Bingle came up with the answer. It's an ancient form of prophecy, crew. If they drop the egg, it means they are not going to have children, and they will not gain any merit. The city boy nodded with bewilderment. Was that egg representing women's ovulating period? The party went on from the afternoon till the evening. The guests sang and danced in the yard, and the chicken raised by the villagers would be boiled and served as the spouses' first meal together. Tien, who could only talk to the village chief in the Thai language, boiled sticky rice with his hand and dipped it in a chili paste, bored, so he quietly left to stroll around the culture yard after finishing his meal. Young girls and the children who were dancing to the music were an adorable sight, but what drew his attention more was the loud cheer in the front. The men, young and old, were standing in a circle playing a game. Ah, crew! One of them called out to the teacher who was coming closer. What are you doing? Even if he couldn't understand the words, he could guess the meaning as he walked closer to look at the thing that was spinning in the middle of the circle. Chong, they tried to explain to him. We're whirling gig. Ken tried to put the words together. You meant whirligig? They quickly nodded, smiling widely and inviting him to join them. The Akha's chong, or whirligig, had a peculiar look. The ones he'd seen before had a sharp, long spike made of iron or metal, but here it was made of sharpened wood with a slimming tip, and the whirligig was bigger than the modern version. The spinning rope was either plastic or hemp tied to another tip of the wood. Ken was born in the age of RC car and went to an elite school. He had never touched and played with the plastic whirligig that was a bonus he got when buying a pack of snacks, nor had he tried a jumping rope game with his friends. He looked at the simple local toy that someone had thrust in his hands, being at his wits' end. The loud cheer came up in Akha language that he couldn't understand, but from their gestures, with stretching movements of the hands, he guessed that they were telling him to pull the rope. The city boy decided to pull the stick with the rope out of the whirligig, and the toy spun a few rounds on the ground before coming to a stop. It didn't even look as great as when the Akha was doing it. The laughter coming from the people around him made him feel numb from an embarrassment with his failed attempt. Ken balled his hands into a fist, furious, burning with the need to prove himself. He strode towards the local who had handed him the toy and demanded with his hands that the man taught him immediately. The Akha man showed him how to throw the whirligig. Normally, he had to wind the rope on one end of the toy spike from the bottom to the top, then wind the rope around the thrower's finger. But with Akha's version, they used a bamboo stalk that had been wetted out into a slim one instead of a finger to increase the centrifugal force that would spin be able to handle the larger and heavier whirligig. It resembled throwing a ball in a baseball game he had played during the summer school in the US. Once he thought of himself as a pitcher with a whirligig in hand instead of a ball, he became more confident. When he flung the stalk and sent the whirligig out with a perfect posture, the man who had taught him looked in awe. The heavy, large toy flew away for some 10 meters before hitting the ground. It spun like a whirlwind before coming to a stop after just a brief moment. Ken flung the toy with different postures, but still, his throws didn't result in a long spinning, like how the Akha accomplished. He stopped and observed if there were any differences between his whirligig and the men's with arms across his chest, frowning. Then he turned to the toy's owner and pointed towards the plastic rope. The guy seemed to realize what the teacher was suggesting and answered with a sheepish smile, waving his hand to say that he didn't have it at the moment. The engineering student had finally figured out what the problem was. The plastic rope was slippery, so it didn't hold onto the surface as well as the hemp one. He looked left and right, searching for a solution for a few moments. If he wanted a rough surface, then he needed sandpaper. If he wanted the rope to be smoother, he had to roll it in the sand. Ken used a fool's logic by rolling the plastic rope on the ground and rolled it with his feet to lessen its slick, smooth surface and wound it around the whirligig. He did another long throw. The wooden toy flew in the air in a smooth arch before hitting the ground and spinning at an astonishingly high speed. The Akha around him looked with wonder on their faces. Ken balled his hands and pulled his arm close to himself, crying out a loud "Yes!" from his successful experiment. He then dragged his partner in crime towards the group of men to challenge them. When evening came, the group of soldiers, who were friends with the local men, had come to congratulate the newlyweds. Captain Pupa showed up in his camouflage pants, knee-high combat boots, and a khaki-greenish t-shirt with a tactical jacket. It showed that he had just returned from a patrolling duty. Doctor Wasant, who was in his semi-casual clothes, walked up to Kama Bingley and handed him a plastic bag with beer and famous whiskey he had bought the day before to show his courteousness. "Thank you, Doctor," Papandau's village chief said, and invited the soldiers to join in the dinner with them on the long litter. He smiled, seeing how the captain was looking around as if he was looking for something. "Are you looking for Krutien? He's over there." Bing Le pointed to the other side of the yard where young and older men gathered. "What's the game they're playing?" The young officer tried to look, but the men were packed and he couldn't see anything. The teacher challenged some guys in whirly gig games. The sharp eyes narrowed. "You must be drunk. Does he even know what a whirly gig is?" "Come on, Captain." Bingley slapped his own forehead. "If you don't believe me, I will show you." He led the tall soldier and walked through the circle of men. An image of a man who just grew out of his teenage years was lifting his leg high in the air and throwing a whirly gig that had a rope around it and connected to a stick as if he was a pro player, made Pupa stopped in his track with amazement. The loud cheer rang in his ears as he stared at the natural bright face with smooth, reddened cheeks, the kind of natural beauty that hadn't been concealed by an urban mask of city life. The troublemaker realized he was being watched and looked up at the captain. He even raised his chin in defiance, with the hands on his hips like a champion. Pupa couldn't help but smile, yet he shook his head in a half-hearted exasperation. He hoped the younger man get out as much as possible from living here the time came. The time when he had to return to his world he had left behind. I never thought Cruquien would be able to complete his term, but now I'll have to think again. The captain looked at Kama. It was obvious Tian had come from an extraordinary background. He could tell from the way the young man dressed and carried himself. So Kama being Liz, who had seen the world, would be able to figure it out too. I could say the same thing, he said plainly, but it felt as if there was a brick in his chest which grew heavier on each passing day. When the time comes, how would he bear the weight then? End of chapter 8.